11 days from now, Filipinos will once again select a next set of leaders. But some determined persons and groups have taken election results into their own hands. The Philippine National Police has recorded a total of 51 incidents of election-related violence, prominently through shootings, harming 77 people. 26 of 31 killed were politicians. Earlier, the Commission on Elections and the PNP released 889 poll hotspots, now called election watch list areas. 106 of those are in the Ilocos region. The top 15 include Abra, Pangasinan, Cagayan, Ilocos Sur, La Union, Pampanga, Nueva Ecija, Batangas, Cavite, Masbate, Samar, Misamis Occidental, Maguindanao, Lanao del Sur, and Basilan.
We have an electoral system that forces candidates to use violence because the stakes are so high. It's either you win or you lose.
Countering election-related violence, the poll body has implemented a gun ban and set up joint checkpoints with the PNP and the AFP, arresting almost 3,000 people and seizing thousands of firearms and more than 20,000 ammunitions.
In our current system, except for the party list, you either win or you lose. And you can imagine if you are an incumbent politician, the pressure and the temptation to use violence to hold on to power is also very great, no? And that adds to the massive election-related violence, no?
Well, the midterm polls are shaping up to be an exciting one. I'm Nancy Irlanda, and this is Elections 2013. Weeks before Election Day, we see the number of election-related violence soaring. Is there an end to this culture of electoral violence in our country? Joining us now, Police Chief Superintendent Generoso Serbo Jr. of the Philippine National Police. With us also, political analyst Mon Casiple of the Institute for Political and Electoral Reform. Gentlemen, good evening and thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
Okay, first of all, why do elections seem to bring certain sectors of society back to the barbaric age, seemingly like a pure unadulterated greed for power?
Well, we're talking of candidates actually who are usually belonging to political clans or political families. And the simple reason there is that they view elections as a contest for power. And not really from an altruistic point of view of serving the people or giving public service. The real reason there is power.
All right. In fact, if we compare apples to apples, if we're just talking about the local elections, there has been a decrease in the number of election-related incidents. Your take on that? Are we evolving to be less barbaric in the political arena?
Well, from my point of view, because I think the police would have a different point of view.
And we'll get to that.
Yeah, the thing that I noticed is that there is also a transitioning of the entire system. Of course, we have the automated election system now, but we should observe also the changes in the electorate. A lot of our voters now are younger. They don't belong to that generation who, have the power agenda.
Okay, let me pick up on that. The automated elections,
Yes.
the youth coming to the fore. You agree? And can you add to the reasons why there has been a decrease in the number of election-related violence incidents?
Well, from the purely police, pure PNP point of view, we contributory factors are, I would say, proliferation of loose firearms. Then we look at the existence of private armed groups. And of course, the intense political rivalries existing in some areas between the contending political parties or candidates.
Are you saying there's less of that? There's less private armies, fewer loose firearms? Because we're saying if apples to apples were to be compared,
But
there are
comparatively, yes, we have a better situation now. This 2013
as regards private
elections
armies?
as compared to 2010. For example, on private armed groups or private armies, as you said it. We have monitored, I think, 112 private armed groups in the year 2010. But now for this 2013 elections, we are monitoring the movements of, I think, 48 private armed groups.
All
So
right.
I would say we are better these elections as compared to 2010.
All right, indeed. Well, authorities have said that they will redouble their efforts to dismantle private armed groups, private armies, if you will, after the Maguindanao massacre. First of all, how do you identify these private armed groups when in fact they should be underground? What are your criteria?
Yeah, we have these intelligence units based on informants, based on intelligence operations of our operatives. So
could
we
this
have
number...
we have this monitoring, and they came up with these 48 private armed groups. And of course, we are also sharing this information or this validation of this information with other security forces, like the Armed Forces of the Philippines and NICA, for example. We are sharing information, and we came up with this number.
Alright. Because of the very nature of these private armed groups, which is of course underground, is it safe to say that the number you peg, you mentioned that it's 48, could be very, very conservative as a reflection of the true number?
More or less, this is the most accurate number that we can come up with.
All right.
That's fairly accurate, I would say.
What other factors can we take out of the equation that would make the political system or elections in particular less vulnerable to violence? You already mentioned private armed groups,
And
loose firearms.
yes.
How about guns for hire groups?
Yeah, that's one of the groups that we are going after. I think we have now monitored 65 groups nationwide. And yes, there is this possibility that these gun for hire groups may be used by some of our candidates in furtherance of their own agenda. And yes, we are going after them.
Is there anything unique or particular to Philippine culture that would lend itself to this kind of violence during elections? What do the police know of profiling of criminals predisposed to election violence?
Well, from our point of view, one of the critical factors that not actually psychological or something, but more of that our people's very passionate when it comes to election, very intense. And that's why a part of our initiatives at the Philippine National Police is to identify these intense political rivalries existing in some areas. And as a part of our countermeasures is to initiate the conduct of, for example, peace covenants and dialogues, bringing into one table the contending political parties and perhaps convince them to not to resort to acts of violence in furtherance of their own political interests.
All right, in the home stretch to the elections, your personal assessment of the success of checkpoints, some say those checkpoints are ironically the points of commotion, and also the election gun ban. Your assessment?
Well, 2 days ago, the Secretary Marojas and the Chief PNP presided the press conference where they veiled what we have done, the actions we have undertaken, and the results of our operations with regards to ensuring safe and fair elections for 2013. And it's good to note that we have accomplished so much when it comes to this campaign to ensure a safe and as mentioned in the early part of the show, we have arrested, I think, a little less than 3,000 person for possession of, because of election gun ban, and confiscated more or less the same number of firearms.
Okay.
So I would say that we're doing good when it comes to this particular campaign.
The Comelec has reclassified just what was generally referred to as election hotspots into areas of concern. How is the interagency coordination going on between the Comelec and police authorities when it comes to monitoring and keeping peace in these new areas of concern?
Yes, we have what we call joint security control centers, and of course we have the Comelec as the Office of Primary Responsibility when it comes to this electoral exercise, and as deputies we have the AFP and the Philippine National Police. And yes, you said it, we are closely coordinating so that we can address all possible security issues and concerns days even before the election period, then going to May 13, then even after, up to the counting, perhaps, of the election results.
All right.
We will be working together.
All right, Mon, you've been following quite a few elections already. Curiously, in 1986, there were fewer election-related deaths than in the 2010 presidential elections. Is this just purely a function of perhaps, just perhaps, there is freer reporting of statistics today?
Well, I would say both. You don't have that kind of a sophisticated survey companies. The media itself is controlled at the time. So report would have been much...
But you find that a curious situation, that there were more election-related deaths in 2010 than there were in 1986?
Well, there are more people running
At least
now.
reported. At least reported.
Yes. The snap election of 1986 was basically between, at the presidential level, and national. So there's not much intense rivalry, not like in a local political contest,
Okay.
where the historical situation has always been rather intense.
What does your training tell you about the comparative nature of national elections and local elections? Local elections being more raw and more bloody, it seems.
Yes, because you're talking here of neighbors, relatives, personal friends fighting it out. In a national, it's more impersonal. I mean, you go through the motions of the electoral campaign without seeing each other most of the times. But in a local area, particularly if there's more or less even chances by two main opponents, the tendency there is to use all methods, and that may include vote buying, electoral cheating, and of course violence. As I've said, the key question there is power.
All right. All right. We see that election-related violence at the local level is indeed down. If you go by the COMELEC's count, it's down by 40%. But still, some people say, because there is still a significant amount, perhaps the authorities are almost helpless, practically helpless, in curbing election-related violence. Your thoughts on that?
Well, the statistic will tell us that...
There's been some headway.
Yeah, but then we are not relying on that statistic.
To what do you attribute that headway made?
Well, with the early preparations of the Philippine National Police, if we can recall, as early as November, we already have this National Task Force, SAFE 2013, and it was presented no less by Secretary Marrojas being the chairman of this National Task Force. And as early as November,
so largely it's preparation.
We are already preparing for this exercise, and when with the election period, January 13, we have already practically deployed all our personnel, and we are already conducting the appropriate campaigns so that we can address these critical factors, those firearms, private armed groups, criminal elements, and even the threat groups. You
mentioned deployment. What kind of changes in deployment do you plan? How do you implement that? And is there extra training, and is there extra equipment procured just specifically in preparation for the elections?
Yes, early in the show you mentioned the election watch list of areas and areas of concern. So basically we will be guided by this threat assessment of areas when it comes to the deployment of our forces. And I would like to mention also that 2 days ago, the Secretary Marrojas and the Chief PNP General Purisima has vowed to produce 30,000 more policemen. We will be pulling out 12,000 policemen undergoing training, and additional 18,000 policemen who are tied up to their desk or performing admin duties. We will be pulling out these men and perhaps generate more or less 30,000 personnel to beef up our security at the ground level, so that to enhance the total security of the elections.
All right, we're going to talk about whether that's because you expect a spike in election-related violence closer to Election Day. We're going to go to a break now. After the break, more issues about electoral violence. A representative from the Commission on Elections will be joining us also. So stay tuned. You're watching Elections 2013. Welcome back. You're watching Elections 2013 still, and we are still talking about election-related violence. Still with us, Police Chief Superintendent Generoso Serbo Jr. of the Philippine National Police, political analyst Mon Casiple of the Institute for Political and Electoral Reform, and joining us now on the set, Cablelink spokesperson James Jimenez. Hello, Mr. Jimenez. Thanks
Hello.
for joining us. The first
Thank you for having
question,
me.
yes, the first question goes to you. According to Cablelink Chairman Sixto Brillantes, 40% down. We're talking about election-related violence
right.
in the local level. Tell us, I mean, from your experience, is it really to be expected that it will be lower when it's not a presidential election?
Well, that's normally the case. People are not as upset about things.
Intense.
People are not as intense about their chances of winning, and there seems to be this general feeling that there's not as much at stake during a midterm elections. So that's
Highly
pretty
subjective.
normal. Of
Tell
course,
that to the people who are carrying out the crimes, right?
exactly. But you have to understand. Also, when we talk about election-related violence, you're not always talking about the candidates themselves, calling the shots. Sometimes it's really just supporters getting all upset. And so you're right, it's pretty subjective. People do get upset still, and people do let themselves get carried away by that.
All right, before we went to the break, I was saying that you were talking about beefing up personnel, perhaps by 30,000, all in the run-up to the election, leading one to believe that you're expecting election-related violence to spike really in and let's bring it up, the hora de peligro. Who wants to define that first? Hora de peligro.
James, what's hora de peligro?
Not siesta time for your
not
toddlers.
siesta time. But
Okay.
hora de peligro, I would suppose that's like the last few days before the elections, when people are really getting desperate about
The hour of danger.
Exactly, not being able to knock out their opponents less fatally, I suppose. So that might be it.
Okay, well, someone defined it as the most intense and anxiety-filled period when last-minute interventions take place. And I will take it to mean that intervention is a euphemism, right? We're talking about
pretty
perhaps,
much.
hopefully not, but
all
murder.
types of intervention.
And yes, okay.
That's the kitchen sink.
Yeah,
Yeah,
much.
everything and the kitchen sink. Okay, so yes, sir. What your thoughts on hora de peligro? How you will handle that, and hopefully that it will not actually happen.
That's why to the minds of our leadership, they've really to maximize the deployment of our personnel. The days leading up to May 13.
All right.
And even after during the counting of election results.
In terms of punishment, does all punishment related to election-related violence coincide with what's in the penal code, or is there something different in terms of punishment?
I think just right.
Yeah,
Just the same.
it's the same thing. It's the same thing. I'd like to point out something that the General Serbo said earlier, that a lot of the decrease that we're seeing now has to do with the early preparations that they had, and proceeding from that, that's probably one way to justify why they're beefing up their forces, is because they want to consolidate the gains from that. Sometimes it's the mere presence of authority. It serves to calm people down. It's not so much that they're expecting a spike, I think. It's just that they don't want to lose whatever headway they've gained already.
So it's preventive
It's
for the most
mostly
part.
preventive, I think.
All
yeah.
right. This might be splitting hairs, but how do you actually tally election-related violence? It's like an argument. It's like the argument about premature campaigning, right? When do you start considering crimes versus politicians as election-related violence if it's not within, let's say, the official campaign period, but in fact the politician was involved in a crime?
Well, before the election period, it's pretty difficult, right? Sometimes people think long, which means basically that they'll kill you now so that you don't get a chance to compete.
Indeed, there was a mayor who was murdered before the official campaign
Which
period,
is why whenever the
early in
police,
Domingo.
the police try to validate these things, they look at the election angle, not ignoring the fact that these politicians have ordinary lives as well. Sometimes the attack on them might be because of what they are outside of the political arena. But when you're inside the election period, then a lot of your observations, a lot of your weighing of facts is really affected by the fact that it is the election period. So they might be, they might have gotten into a scuffle with someone, but that's something that you use to rule out the election angle. So election angle is, I think, pretty much the default.
All right. Okay, so it's really during the election
Because of the
period
election
then.
period, yes.
So that's, if you want to be strict on statistics, you'll have to base it on the start of the official campaign period?
Well, that's normally when we start looking at it, yes.
Okay. Mon, shouldn't the coalitions or the politicians themselves have a stake in lowering the rate of election-related violence? I mean, can't that actually be part of their platform? Interesting,
well,
right?
it can, but the reality, of course, is that when you're contending for power and there's weak political party system, you cannot depend for money, for example, from the party, and you have to strategize your own campaign and so on. The tendency there is the party doesn't have that kind of influence.
All right, in which it should.
It should have.
If we were
It
to
should
have actual parties, because now it's mostly coalitions and alliances.
Yeah, the politicians will have to be answerable to the party, and the parties will be answerable to the people and also to Comelec.
Okay, how does the expectation of election-related violence then affect the strategy of campaigning?
Well, if there's political party and you are a nominee, a candidate of that party, the party will have a responsibility over you. Actually, not only during election period, but even during the governance period. And that has been the norm of most mature political systems. That's why violence in those systems are rare.
If I use the phrase culture of impunity, how would you take that further?
Well, it's not much related to the election historically. It's more of the human rights side of it, meaning during the period of martial law and so on. But it can be extended to politics precisely because most of the actors during those periods are also the actors now. And people, both the politicians, the voters, and even the people in government, came to accept the normalcy, quote unquote, of violence in a political contest.
All right. We have, you have identified 15 top priority
Yes,
areas. Are those all the usual suspects? Do we see any emerging areas that are becoming the hotspots that perhaps they were not in past elections?
Yeah, more or less the same
More or less it's
areas.
Mindanao,
Because one
yes.
of the parameters that we have used in
Ilocos.
identifying these areas, the occurrence of election-related violent incidents in the past elections, and also the presence of intense political rivalries, like the traditional contenders during elections. So basically, those are the factors that, so more or less the same areas
Okay,
that we have identified.
The areas that you've identified, would you be able to tell us how much more you've increased your presence in those areas?
One of the measures undertaken by the Philippine National Police is to create a regional special operations task group in these identified areas. We mentioned 15 provinces from Region 1 to ARMM, and that's the approach undertaken by the Chief PNP, so that we have a dedicated security force that will address all issues and concerns that will occur in these provinces. Loose firearms, private armed groups, criminal elements, and threat groups. So basically, that is what we have done so that we can more or less prevent or lessen the occurrence of these election-related violent incidents.
But in terms of the actual number of police personnel, say for example, let's say for example, we have identified Ilocos Sur, for example. If it were X number of personnel before, how many in terms of increase in the number of police visibility personnel would be a comfort level?
Yeah, there would be substantial increase in the number of personnel that would be deployed in that particular province. I cannot cite a specific number, but
Or percentage.
more or less substantial. More or less 100, 150.
But I mean, would you double?
And,
I guess
and these are dedicated, and these are special units that would more or less will conduct focused police operations like service of search warrants against identified hideouts or bailiwicks of private armed groups, and service of warrants of arrest against identified criminal elements or personalities that we perceive may have a role in this occurrence of these election-related violent incidents.
Okay, I asked General Serbo this question earlier, but this feeling of helplessness against electoral violence, of course, again, I put that in context, the number is going down. But still, why can't we just take this out of the system? But maybe not totally, but just not make it anything significant that has to do with our elections.
I know what you mean. We've been saying that the numbers have gone down. But the truth of the matter is that even just one death is too much, right? And it really feels frustrating sometimes why we can't get rid of this. But it really boils down to the people who are involved. The decision to be violent is something that they make, not us, not the peacekeepers, not the regulators. It's them, it's the politicians. The change has to be coming from there somewhere.
All right, and when it comes to keeping the peace, how do you assess the quality of the coordination between all agencies involved? COMELEC and the PNP, COMELEC and the AFP, COMELEC with other agencies of government?
The interagency cooperation is getting better every election. It is.
Okay. When you say getting better, what were the areas for improvement?
Well, certainly communications is key. We talk more, I think, than we used to. A lot of that has to do with modern technology being available now. Also, the coordination of acts between the agencies is also much better now than it could have been before. And so we think that we're really getting the hang of this thing. And it shows in the results that we're getting. Again, like I said, not to put too much of a point on the decrease of violence, but the fact of the matter is, COMELEC and other interested groups, we talk about this all the time. The PNP is doing a yeoman's job of keeping the violence down, and the net result is that it's a more peaceful environment. A lot of that has to do also with the fact that, again, like we said, and this is something that we always say, it's the nature of the elections as well. It's a midterm elections. Hopefully, this kind of cooperation, this kind of level of coordination will continue until
Will level up
2016,
until the presidential
or
elections.
even get better.
All right, I asked this question of General Serber earlier. The factors that could contribute to making elections vulnerable to violence. You have your private armies, you have your guns for hire, you have your loose firearms.
Absolutely.
Throw in, if you will, other factors that could get on that list that makes elections vulnerable to violence.
One of the things that was mentioned in 2010 was that perhaps automation might actually be to blame for that as well. In previous elections before automation, a lot of candidates felt that they could actually manipulate the results before they came out, before they were actually made official.
So are you saying that automation, curiously enough and ironically enough, could contribute to violence?
We certainly say that automation has led people to go back to vote buying as a modality of cheating. I don't think there have been any studies about it, but it's certainly something worth looking at. Does automation create a sort of desperation, among candidates who normally wouldn't be able to win without cheating? So that's something that we might want to look at. And then I guess if we're being honest with ourselves, that's something that you have to talk about as well.
All right, Mon, that runs absolutely counter to what you said earlier, which is maybe the 40% decrease in violence, at least at the local level, can be explained away by automated elections.
Well, yes, because many of the flashpoints are in the precincts. And when there's no human counting the ballot, there's no reason
I
for
see.
violence.
I get what you mean. We're talking about two different points in the election continuum. He's talking about violence on election day. Absolutely, we've seen a decrease in that. Why? Because there's really no point in harassing the teachers because the teachers don't control the count. So there's no violence there. I was talking more about the pre-election period when people are afraid of facing up against strong opponents. So they just maybe decide to do a little scaring. And sometimes the scaring gets out of hand. So we're talking about two different parts of the election cycle. And certainly, I have to agree with Mon, because automation is in place, there really is no value in people scaring teachers or people waving their guns around on election day. Hindi na kasi nila nakokontrol yan eh. What they can control is, coming into the elections, is this person still a candidate? Or is this person, has this person been scared enough to just back out?
All right, further to the factors that you could take out of the equation, obviously the COMELEC is looking at liquor as a factor because you're extending the liquor ban
Yes.
from 2 days to 5 days.
We'd like to thank MMDA for that because that was their suggestion.
What kind of what kind of scientific data would back that? That if you're sober for 5 days before the elections, there will be less. Just teasing.
I really don't know. Some people actually say that if you're drunk, you're a little more peaceful. But first of all, credit where credit is due. The idea came from MMDA, and that was given to the COMELEC as a proposal. And they proposed a longer period for the liquor ban. But of course, weighing all the different aspects of this whole thing, we decided that we could give 5 days,
All right. And that's
an additional
already
3 days.
in a resolution.
It's in a resolution, and that's 3 days on top of the 2 days that are mandated by law. So it starts on May 9.
All right, just to close, on election day, in days past, you would have that ugly picture, of ballot box snatching, the religious, linking arms just to protect the ballot box. What, in a worst case scenario, could be the ugly picture of election violence on May 13 at the precinct level? Now that we're automated, it's a different ballgame.
Well, the worst case scenario that we can think of is, attacks of threat groups to disrupt the election proper during on May 13.
So terrorism.
So acts of terrorism from some threat groups. So perhaps that's the worst thing I can
Do
think
you
of.
have any intelligence reports as we speak that there might be
As
these
of now,
activities
we
planned?
do not have any specific threat or any specific information that we can attribute to these threat groups. But basically, we're going to address this concern during on May 13. We're going to deploy PNP personnel in cooperation with AFP so that we can act on this worst case scenario in case it happens.
All right, on that note, here's to a safe and peaceful May 13. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us this evening. Thanks to our guests, Police Chief Superintendent Generoso Serbo Jr. of the Philippine National Police, political analyst Mon Casiple of the Institute for Political and Electoral Reform, and from the Commission on Elections, spokesperson James Jimenez. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Tune in again next week as we make this vote count. I'm Nancy Irlanda, and this is Elections 2013.